there's a lot of people just worried about the overhead, the overhead, the overhead, the overhead. It's like, ugh, sure. However, end range of anything is going to give you really detailed information. And when we have difficulty traveling through the sagittal plane, which is say flexion extension, or in this case, like hyperextension, it's very telling that we have some low-hanging fruit that we can knock out and improve function very quickly. Someone starts to lack like, a bit of internal or external rotation. It's like, okay, this could be a problem that's like maybe a little bit more nuanced. But every time I see someone that lacks a certain level of internal and external rotation, which if we were to kind of bookmark this, if you're taking notes at home, complexity of planes of movement progress from sagittal, frontal to transverse. So when people look at, I don't have a lot of IR or ER in my shoulder, it's like, okay, that's a really downstream problem, right? That was what we refer to as a transverse plane problem. It's like, let's peel it back. Let's see how you move through the frontal plane. Like, can you move the rib cage through the frontal plane, right? No. Okay, can you move the humerus through the sagittal plane? It's like, oh, wow, the limitation I'm seeing through the vector of internal and external rotation, through the vector of the transverse plane, is actually much more easier to perceive if I just assess a limitation through the sagittal plane. And rarely, if ever, have I seen a limitation exist at the transverse plane. There's some specific cases of some high-end athletes, pitchers would be one, without a deficiency in the sagittal plane. So most people are going to really struggle flexion extension, getting into the hyperextended position, and then getting into the overhead position. And I prefer to use that order of things because one of the problems that the bodybuilding world has when it comes to accurately diagnosing and intervening around shoulder function, more specifically shoulder function as it pertains to pressing mechanics, is when they lack overhead position, they immediately just try and improve their overhead position by trying to put their arm over their head. It's like, what universe is that a logical sequence of events, right? It's like, you can't get there. Yeah, but if I just do it with weight, hold my beer, or actually give me a heavy beer and I'll do a wide track raise with it. It's like, dude, are you out of your fucking mind? Like, weight can resist muscles or assist a deviation in center of mass. In this case, it's doing none of those well, right? So if you grab a 2.5 pound weight, it's not going to assist you in pulling you into this. Oh, I'm going to strengthen my lower trap. Not in a million years. You know how you're going to strengthen your lower trap? By learning how to do a dip first. Because you know what their lower trap actually does? It doesn't do this YMCA bullshit. It actually stops your shoulder blades from elevating. What's going to happen when we get to the starting position of a dip where our arms are at our sides, where I've never seen a single person struggle with the range of motion required to get their arms at their sides? Their arms are going to be at their sides at the start of the dip, and we're going to have to resist the traps from coming up towards the shoulders, right? So what's going to happen is I resist the upper traps from coming to my shoulders. My lower traps are holding that down. So I think a principle of pressing function, as far as like we're just talking about pure assessment, is like, can you get your arms behind you?
Yeah.
Right? And sometimes there's issues with that assessment because people don't realize that, look, in order to get your arms behind you, you actually need to be able to abduct your arms, right? So if I keep my arms right at my sides, I try and drive my elbows all the way to the back of the room and get my arms at hyperextension, front of my shoulder is going to roll forward, right? And no matter how much you train or how much you stretch, that'll always be the case. But if I like abduct, I'm a little bit, there's a range between about 45 to 60 degrees. If I abduct to like 50 degrees for me, maybe 45 or 40 degrees for someone a little bit narrower, I can get my arms behind me, no problem, right? So it's like, first, if we're going to assess someone's shoulder hyperextension, make sure that there's not a bone in the way. Make sure your scapula is actually not in the way. And that will be a really good point. And if they can't get it into shoulder hyperextension, that's a little bit of an easier problem to unpack. We can grade that because I can just take someone, you can't get into a dip position, a bottom of a dip position without excruciating pain. What if you just held the arm at your side? Oh, wow, yeah. And then introduce the mechanics. Can you hold your arm at your side with a stacked rib cage and pelvis? Immediately watch people get the speed wobbles. And you're just like, oh, well, hey, dude, you're trying to like dip your body weight plus 90 pounds, 135, but you can't actually keep your lower traps from going right up to your upper traps from going right to your ears with no weight in a stacked position. Like, that tells me that you're missing a lot of the underlying mechanics required to get in the overhead position. So that's kind of like thing number 1 and 2. It's like, yes, when you get to the overhead position, it's like a buffer of function, and you got to keep touching home base with it with any sort of exercise. Like I love that you talked about the overhead tricep extension. I think that's a great proxy for the overhead position for a lot of bodybuilders who might not be going into the overhead position with a press in some cases, or might not be going into the overhead position with a barbell in most cases. But getting overhead and trying to get like a humerus that is perpendicular to the floor, that can be something that's super effective, because if your elbow starts to hurt or your wrist starts to hurt or your shoulder starts to hurt, hey man, red flag. This is probably the least loaded position that still effectively trains the muscle. So what I mean by that is like, getting into that pure overhead position for the tricep is not going to be super beneficial if we're training the bicep. It's not going to be super beneficial if we're training the delt. And, depending on the way you're training your lats, most guys aren't probably getting into the full overhead position in the way they train their lats, right? So it's going to be a unique exposure to a true 180 degrees humerus. And if you start having issues there, it's like you're leaving a lot on the table as you bring that dysfunction down into planes more consistent with the muscles that you train, right? You said that, look, even though your push jerk is going to be way more than your bench press, you can still bench press more than someone who bench presses what you bench press but doesn't push jerk, and who bench presses all the time. So when you start to build these end ranges that expose your shoulder to dysfunction, and for those of you watching the podcast at home, I don't know what's happened to the weather outside. I feel like I'm doing this Blair Witch style. It got dark in here.
Yeah, it's dark over there. Homie.
I'm waiting for this, like the knife to come in and just jab me, and I'm hoping. I could use.
Don't leave me, man. I can't do this without you.
All right, I'll fend off the fucking Mike Myers. I don't even think I could fend off Michael Myers, the actor, right now. Now this Mexican shit got me. I'm losing. Anyways, but you brought up an interesting point, right? So you work in the overhead. I would say that you work in more like exposure ranges of the shoulder, right? So in level 2, we talk about exposure ranges, and you can bring a shoulder that's been exposed to greater levels and demands of internal muscular stability or function, and you can bring that into the realm of stable within, pushing horizontally. That person who's only ever trained or exclusively or disproportionately trained overhead and hyperextended positions, where we have to use a lot of this internal stability and we really are reliant on positions and coordination and timing. You bring that into the wheelhouse of a bodybuilder, 45-degree incline, horizontal press, 45-degree decline. That person is going to smoke someone who's only trained those planes, that doesn't have that supported function underlying the shoulder. So if you're a bodybuilder, you don't have to get into the overhead position. You don't have to do some of these more, power movements. However, no, you do need to get into the overhead. You need to make sure that you can get there by any means necessary. Like, can you do an overhead tricep extension? Can you do, and this is something that I find myself prescribing to bodybuilders all the time, go on the assisted dip machine when the nice 55-year-old lady is done using it, and then you, at 8% body fat, who's trying to tell me that they don't have, the shoulder mechanics issues, let's put the pin right at the bottom, because you're super fucking weak where you should be strong, and then just really grade the exposure of that hyperextension to a tolerance. Like, there's no more of an eye-opening moment to someone who is really more conventionally hypertrophy trained and doesn't pay much attention to joint mechanics. They only look at muscular mechanics. There's nothing like sending them over to a dip machine and being like, like my shoulders are going to explode. It's like, don't you think that's a problem? Like, don't you think that's a rate limiter? Like, do you think a shoulder that can't press itself up is a shoulder that probably can't grow as much muscle as it could? Like, don't you think that this may be the problem? Like, that the discrepancy in ability for someone that can curl their own body weight but can't do a dip with their own body weight. It's like, dog, this is basic shit. As far as your human body and the joint mechanics, or as I would refer to arthrokinematics, are concerned, this is day one stuff. This, to me, to coin a phrase, is when your strength has outrun your stability. You have this uncanny ability to exert force, but you have an absolute dog shit ability to resist force. Right? The thoughts of keeping their ears away from their shoulders at the top of a dip, even with the full stack on, becomes a monumental task, especially when you start to cue the mechanics that you started off this whole thing with. Can you do it with your rib cage stacked over your pelvis? You know what they're going to fall into? They're going to fall into their structure. They're going to extend on this dip machine. right? They're going to drive their sternum to the ceiling. They're going to have all this anterior expansion of their abdomen. They're going to compress the shit out of their shoulder blades. It's like, no, tuck that in. So I think that's two things off the jump that I think are really, really important. It's like incrementally improve your overhead by starting with a low reach. And if you start with a low reach, make sure if you can't do it that you titrate your ability and strength and skill to a point where you can. As that starts to happen, once we get people doing body weight dips, oh, wouldn't you know it, their overhead mobility improves, right? Because we've trained the requisite scapular and ribcage mechanics to make that easy. It's like studying for the test, right? When people try and put their arm over their head, by just putting their arm over their head, thinking that that's going to work, that's like studying practice tests. You didn't actually learn the skills necessary to do that, right? It's kind of cheating. You're not going to get anywhere that way. I feel like my mother.